though.
They were called the Holy Order of Amir. They were the strong right hand of the church. Better jot? Fine, if it will keep you quiet through the rest of the story. The old beggar was delighted, for he knew the Amir were a part of Telu's church, and the church was sometimes generous to the poor. The Amir came to his feet as the old man approached. "Who goes there?" he asked. His voice was proud and powerful, but also tired. "No, I am of the Order Amir. None should come between me and my tasks. I will act for the good of all, though gods and men might bar my way." "Sir," the beggar said, "I'm just hoping for a piece of fire and some charity on a long road." The Amir gestured the old man forward. He was armored in a suit of bright steel rings, and his sword was tall as a man. His tabard was of shining white, but from the elbows the color darkened into crimson, as if dipped in blood. In the center of his chest he wore the symbol of the Amir, the black tower wrapped in a crimson flame. The old man sat near the fire and gave a sigh as the heat soaked into his bones. After a moment, the Amir spoke. "I am afraid I can offer you nothing to eat. My horse eats better than I do tonight, but that does not mean that he eats well." "Anything would be a lovely help," the old man said. "Scraps are more than what I have. I am not proud." The Amir sighed. "Tomorrow, I must ride 50 miles to stop a trial. If I fail or falter, an innocent woman will die. This is all I have." The Amir gestured to a piece of cloth with a crust of bread and a sliver of cheese. Both of them together would hardly be enough to dent the old man's hunger. It made a poor dinner for a man as large as the Amir. "Tomorrow, I must ride and fight," the armored man said. "I need my strength, so I must weigh your night of hunger against this woman's life." As he spoke, the Amir raised his hands and held them palms up like the plates of a balancing scale. When he made this motion, the old beggar saw the backs of the Amir's hands, and for a second he thought the Amir had cut himself, and that blood was running between his fingers and down his arms. Then the fire shifted, and the beggar saw it was only a tattoo, though he still shivered at the bloody markings on the Amir's hands and arms. He would have done more than shiver had he known all that those markings meant. They showed the Amir was trusted so completely by the order that his actions would never be questioned. And as the order stood behind him, no church, no court, no king could move against him. For he was one of the Siridae, highest of the Amir. If he killed an unarmed man, it was not murder in the order's eyes. If he strangled a pregnant woman in the middle of the street, none would speak against him. Should he burn a church or break an old stone bridge, the empire held him blameless, trusting all he did was in the service of the greater good. But the beggar knew none of this, and so he tried again. "If you don't have any food to spare, could I have a penny or two?" He thought of the Sealdish camp, and how he might buy a slice of meat or bread. The Amir shook his head. "If I did, I would gladly give it. But 3 days ago I gave the last of my money to a new widower with a hungry child. I have been penniless as you are ever since." He shook his head, his expression weary and full of regret. "I wish circumstances were different, but I now must sleep, so you must go." The old man was hardly happy about this, but there was something in the Amir's voice that made him wary. So he creaked back onto his feet and left the fire behind. Before the warmth of the Amir's fire could leave him, the old man tightened his belt and made up his mind to simply walk through till morning, hoping the end of his road might bring him better luck, or at least a meeting with some kinder folk. So he walked through the center of Feirinio, and as he did, he saw a circle of great gray stones. Inside that circle was the faint glow of firelight hidden in a well-dug pit. The old man noticed he couldn't smell a wisp of smoke either, and realized these folk were burning Rennel wood, which burns hot and hard, but doesn't smoke or stink.
Take out these signs.
Then the old man saw that two of the great shapes were not stones at all. They were wagons. A handful of people huddled round a cookpot in the dim light of the fire.
I may have done it in the worst.
But the old man didn't have a shred of hope left, so he kept walking. He was almost past the stones when a voice called out, "Ho there! Who are you, and why do you pass by so quietly at night?" "I'm nobody," the old man said. "Just an old beggar, following my road until its end." "Why are you out walking instead of settling down to sleep? These roads are not all safe at night," the voice replied. "I have no bed," the old man said, "and tonight I cannot beg or borrow one for all the world." "There is one here for you, if you would like it, and a bit of dinner if you've a mind to share. No one should walk all day and night besides." A handsome, bearded man stepped from the concealment of the tall gray stones. He took the old man's elbow and led him toward the fire, calling ahead, "We have a guest tonight!" There was a small stir of motion ahead of them, but the night was moonless, and their fire was deep in the concealing pit, so the beggar couldn't see much of what was being done. Curious, he asked, "Why do you hide your fire?" His host sighed. "Not all folk are filled with love for us. We're safest by being out of harm's way. Besides, our fire is small tonight." "Why is that?" the beggar asked. "With so many trees, wood should be easy to come by." "We went gathering earlier," the bearded man explained, "but folk called us thieves and shot arrows at us." He shrugged. "So we make do, and tomorrow will take care of itself." He shook his head. "But I am talking too much. May I offer you a drink, father?" "A bit of water, if you can spare it." "Nonsense. You will have wine." It had been a long time since the beggar had tasted wine, and the thought of it was enough to set his mouth all a-watering. But he knew wine was not the best thing for an empty stomach that had walked all day, so he said, "You are kind, bless you. But water is good enough for me." The man at his elbow smiled. "Then have water and wine, each to your desire." And saying so, he brought the beggar to their water barrel. The old beggar bent and drew up a ladle of water. When it touched his lips, it was cool and sweet. But as he drew up the ladle, he couldn't help but notice the barrel was very nearly empty. In spite of this, his host urged him, "Take another and wash the dust from your hands and face. I can tell you've been on the road for a long and weary while." So the old beggar took a second dipper of water, and once his hands and face were clean, he felt much refreshed. Then his host took his elbow again and led him to the fire. "What is your name, father?" Again, the beggar was surprised. It had been years since anyone had cared enough to ask his name. It had been so long, he had to stop and think about it for a moment. "Skiop," he said at last. "I am called Skiop. And you?" "My name is Terrace," his host said as he made the old man comfortable close to the fire. "This is Scylla, my wife, and Wint, our son. This is Shari, and Bentham, and Lil, and Peter, and Fent." Then Terrace brought Skiop wine. Scylla gave him a heavy ladle of potato soup, a slice of warm bread, and half a golden summer squash with sweet butter in the bowl of it. It was plain, and there was not a lot, but to Skiop it seemed a feast. And as he ate, Wint kept his cup full of wine and smiled at him, and sat by his knee and called him grandfather. The last was too much for the old beggar. He began to cry softly. Perhaps it was that he was old, and his day had been a long one. Perhaps it was that he was not used to kindness. Perhaps it was the wine. Whatever the reason, tears began to trickle down his face and lose themselves in his deep white beard. Terrace saw this and was quick to ask, "Father, whatever is the matter?" "I am a silly old man. Skiop said, more to himself than to the rest of them. "You have been kinder to me than anyone in years, and I'm sorry I cannot repay you." Terrace smiled and laid a hand on the old man's back. "Would you really like to pay?" I cannot. I have nothing to give you." Terrace's smile widened.
Oscar's on top of me.
"Skiop,
Dude, can this guy
we
stop
are
us?
the Adima Ru. The thing we value most is something everyone possesses." One by one, Skiop saw the faces around the fire look up at him expectantly. Terrace said, "You could tell us your story." Not knowing what else to do, Skiop began to speak. He told how he had come to Faerinial, how he had walked from one fire to the next, hoping for charity. At first, his voice faltered and his story stumbled, for he had been alone a long time and was not used to talking. But soon, his voice became stronger, his words bolder, and as the fire flickered and reflected in his bright blue eyes, his hands danced along with his old dried voice. Even the Adima Ru, who know all the stories in the world, could do nothing but listen in wonder. When his story came to an end, the troopers stirred as if waking from a deep sleep. For a moment, they did nothing but look at each other. Then they looked at Skiop. Terrace knew what they were thinking.
That's a head glitch that they are sitting on.
"Skiop?"
Jesus.
he asked gently. "Where were you headed when I stopped you tonight?"
There's two on me and one of you guys.
"I was going to Tinue," said Skiop, who was a little embarrassed at how caught up in the story he had become.
Still holding.
His face was hot and red, and he felt foolish.
This guy's 1 HP on me. You guys
"We
see-
are
on my
bound
rock,
for
you see him?
Belene
He's 1
ourselves,"
HP.
Terrace said. "Would you consider coming with us instead?" For a moment, Skiop's face lit with hope, but then it fell. "I would be nothing but a burden. Even a beggar has his pride." Terrace laughed. "You would tell the Adima about pride? We do not ask you out of pity. We ask because you belong in our family, and we would have you tell us a dozen stories in the years to come." The beggar shook his head. "My blood is not yours. I am not a part of your family." "What does that have to do with the price of butter?" Terrace asked. "We Ru decide who is a part of our family and who is not. You belong with us. Look around and see if I am lying." Skiop looked up at the circle of faces and saw what Terrace said was true. And so the old man stayed and lived with them for many years before they parted ways. Many things he saw, and many stories he told, and everyone was wiser in the end because of it. This thing happened, though it was years and miles away. I have heard it from the mouths of the Adima Ru, and thus I know it to be true.
My bad, chef.
Chapter 38, Kernels of Truth. "Is that the end?" Simon asked after a polite pause.
On this door.
He was on his back, looking up at the stars. "Yes." "It didn't end the way I thought it would,"
Might be 2 duos.
he said. "What did you expect?" "I was waiting to find out who the beggar really was. I thought as soon as someone was nice to him, he would turn out to be Taborlin the Great. Then he would give them his walking stick and a sack of money and, I don't know, make something magical happen." Willem spoke up. "He'd say, 'Whenever you are in danger, knock this stick on the ground and say, "Stick, be quick!" And then the stick would whirl around and defend them from whoever was attacking them.'" Willem was lying on his back in the tall grass, too.
Wow.
"I didn't think he was really an old
You guys on the
beggar."
other side?
"Old beggars in stories are never really old beggars," Simon said with a hint of accusation in his voice. "They're always a witch or a prince or an angel or something.
Guys hitting a 90.
In real life, old beggars are almost always old beggars," I pointed out. "But I know what kind of story you two are thinking about. Those are stories we tell other people to entertain them. This story is different. It's one we tell each other.
A little plus 370.
Why tell a story if it's not entertaining? To help us remember. To teach us," I made a vague gesture, "things. Like exaggerated stereotypes?" Simon asked. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, nettled. "Tie him to the wagon and make him pull," Simon made a disgusted noise. I'd be offended if I didn't know you. If I didn't know you, I said hotly, I'd be offended. Do you know Aturans used to kill people if they found them living on the road? One of your emperors declared them to be detrimental to the empire. Most were little more than beggars who had lost their homes because of the wars and taxes. Most were simply press-ganged into military service. I tugged at the front of my shirt. But the Edema were especially prized. They hunted us like foxes. For 100 years, roo hunt was a favorite pastime among the Aturan upper crust. A profound silence fell. My throat hurt, and I realized I'd been shouting. Simon's voice was muffled. I didn't know that. I kicked myself mentally and sighed. I'm sorry, Simon. It was a long time ago, and it's not your fault. It's an old story.
It's not that kind of math.
It would have to be, to have a reference to the Emir, Willem said, obviously trying to change the subject. They disbanded, what, 300 years ago?
150, I think?
Still, I said. There's some truth in most stereotypes. A seed they sprouted from. Basil is from Vintas, Willem said, and he is odd about certain things. Sleeps with a penny underneath his pillow, that sort of thing.
How much are we up today?
On my way to the university, I traveled with a pair of Adem mercenaries, Simon said. They didn't talk to anyone except each other, and they were restless and fidgety.
Down from what we had earlier.
Willem spoke hesitantly.
Up from what I had earlier.
I will admit to knowing many sealdom who take great care to line their boots with silver. Purses, Sim corrected him. Boots are for putting your feet in. He wiggled a foot to illustrate. I know what a boot is, Willem said crossly. I speak this vulgar language better than you do.
You are
Boot is what we say, patu. Money in your purse is for spending. Money you plan to keep is in your boot. Oh, Simon said thoughtfully. I see. Like saving it for a rainy day, I guess. What do you do with money when it rains? Willem asked, genuinely puzzled. And there's more to the story than you think, I interjected quickly before things digressed any further. The story holds a kernel of truth.
You're at like 23 now.
If you promise to keep it to yourselves, I will tell you a secret. I felt their attention sharpen onto me. If you ever accept the hospitality of a traveling troupe, and they offer you wine before anything else, they are a Demaru. That part of the story is true. I held up a finger to caution them. But don't take the wine. But I like wine, Simon said piteously. That doesn't matter, I said. Your host offers you wine, but you insist on water. It might even turn into a competition of sorts, the host offering more and more grandly, the guest refusing more and more politely. When you do this, they will know you are a friend of the Edema, and that you know our ways. They will treat you like family for the night, as opposed to being a mere guest. The conversation lulled as they absorbed this piece of information. I looked up at the stars, tracing the familiar constellations in my head. Iwan the hunter, the crucible, the young again mother, the fire-tongued fox, the broken tower. Where would you go if you could go anywhere? Simon's question came out of the blue. Across the river, I said. Bed. Oh, no, he protested. I mean, if you could go anywhere in the world. Same answer, I said. I've been a lot of places. This is where I've always wanted to go. But not forever, Willem said. You don't want to be here forever, do you?
Oh, yeah, because it's just
That's what I meant, Simon added.
It's abused in
We all want to be here, but none of us want to be here forever. Except Manette, Will said. Where would you go? Simon pursued his point doggedly. For adventure? I thought for a moment, quietly. I guess I'd go to the Tallenwald, I said. Among the Tal? Willem asked. They're a primitive nomadic people, from what I've heard.
What sense do you play?
Technically speaking, the Ademaru are a nomadic people, I said dryly. I heard a story once that said the leaders of their tribe aren't great warriors. They're singers. Their songs can heal the sick and make the trees dance. I shrugged. I'd go there and find out if it was true. I would go to the Fae in court, Willem said. Simon laughed. You can't pick that. Why not? Willem said, with a quick anger.
Everybody's told me that.
If Kvothe can go to a singing tree, I can go into Fane and dance with Imbrula, with Fane women. The Tal is real, Sim protested. Fairy stories are for drunks, half-wits, and children. Where would you go? I asked Simon to keep him from antagonizing Willem. There was a long pause. I don't know, he said, his voice oddly empty of any inflection.
That's fucked up.
I haven't been anywhere, really. I only came to the university because after my brothers inherit and my sister gets her dowry, there isn't going to be much for me except the family name.
I think 4-4 is just...
You didn't want to come here? I asked, disbelief coloring my voice. Sim made a non-committal shrug, and I was about to ask him something else when I was interrupted by the sound of Willem getting noisily to his feet. Are we feeling up to the bridge now? My head felt remarkably clear. I got to my feet with only a slight wobble. Fine by me. Just a second. Simmons started to undo his pants as he moved toward the trees. As soon as he was out of sight, Willem leaned close to me. Don't ask about his family, he said quietly. It is not easy for him to speak about. Worse when he is drunk. What? He made a sharp motion with his hand, shaking his head. Later. Simon bumbled back into the clearing, and the three of us made our silent way back to the road, then over Stonebridge, and into the university.
I remember playing Money Twos with Scariotic on my team.
Chapter 39, Contradictions.
And you...
Late next morning, Will and I made our way to the archives to meet up with Sim and settle our bets of the night before. The problem is his father, Willem explained in low tones as we made our way between the gray buildings. Sim's father holds a duchy in Aitor. Good land, but hold on, I interrupted. Our little Sim's father is a duke? Little Sim, Will said dryly, is 3 years older than you and 2 inches taller. Which duchy? I asked. And he's not that much taller.
I used to play with Vader a shit ton.
Dalanir, Willem said. But you know how it is. Noble blood from Aitor. Small wonder he does not speak of it. Oh, come on, I chided, gesturing to the students filling the streets around us. The university has the most open-minded atmosphere since the church burned Caleptina to the ground. I notice you do not make any loud announcement that you're a Dimaru. I bristled.
No, I couldn't.
Are you implying I'm embarrassed?
Hey, you were a fucking cheat code on
I am saying you make no loud announcement, Will said calmly, giving me a steady look.
I started playing.
Neither does Simon. I imagine you both have your reasons. Pushing down my irritation, I nodded. Willem continued. Dalanir is in the north of Aeterna, so they are reasonably well off. But he has 3 older brothers and 2 sisters. The first son inherits. The father bought the second a military commission. The third was placed in the church. Simon, Willem trailed off suggestively. I have a hard time imagining Sim as a priest, I admitted. Or a soldier, come to think of it. And so Sim ends up at the university, Willem finished. His father was hoping he would become a diplomat. Then Sim discovered he liked alchemy and poetry and entered the Arcanum. His father was not entirely pleased. Willem gave me a significant look, and I gathered he was drastically understating the case. Being an arcanist is a remarkable thing, I protested. Much more impressive than being a perfumed toady in some court.
I didn't even know him that well.
Willem shrugged. His tuition is paid. His allowance continues.
Oh,
he paused to wave at someone on the other side of the courtyard. But Simon does not go home, not even for a brief visit. Sim's father likes to hunt, fight, drink, and wench. I suspect our gentle, bookish Sim was probably not given the love a clever son deserves. Will and I met up with Sim in our usual reading hole and clarified the details of our drunken wagers. Then, we went our separate ways. An hour later, I returned with a modest armload of books. My search had been made considerably easier by the fact that I'd been researching the Amir since Nina had arrived and given me her scroll.
I have no idea what...
I knocked softly on the door of the reading hole, then let myself in. Will and Sim were already sitting at the table.
There's nobody in this
Me
game.
first,
There's 6 squads alive.
Simmons said happily.
And I haven't shot my gun
He
yet.
consulted a list, then pulled a book from his stack.
Wait, where?
Page 152.
Oh, shit.
He leafed through until he found the page, and then began to scan it. Aha!
I'll steer out for you though.
The girl then gave an account of everything, blah, 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 and led them to the place where she stumbled on to the pagan frolic. He looked up, pointing at the page. See? It says pagan right there. I sat down. Let's see the rest. Sim's second book was more of the same, but the third held something of a surprise. A large preponderance of marker stones in the vicinity, suggesting this area might have been crossed with trade routes in some forgotten past. He trailed off, then shrugged and handed the book to me. This one seems to be on your side. I couldn't help but laugh. Didn't you read these before you brought them here? In an hour? He gave a laugh of his own. Not likely. I just used a scriv. Willem gave him a dark look. No, you didn't. You asked Puppet, didn't you? Simon assumed an innocent expression, which, on his naturally innocent face, only served to make him look profoundly guilty. I might have stopped in to see him, he hedged, and he might have happened to suggest a couple books that had information about Greystones. Seeing Willem's expression, he raised a hand. Don't get sniffy on me.
I'm breaking that shape.
It's backfired anyway.
Wow, I just got
Puppet again, I grumbled.
I basically killed
Are
him.
you ever going to introduce me? The two of you are so tight-lipped about him. Willem shrugged.
1 HP.
You will understand when you meet
He
him.
was 1 HP. He was on your left.
Sim's books divided into 3 categories. One supported his side, telling of pagan rites and animal sacrifices. The other speculated about an ancient civilization that used them as marker stones for roads, despite the fact that some were located on sheer mountainsides or river bottoms where no road could be. His final book was interesting for other reasons. A pair of matched stone monoliths with a third across the top, Simon read. The locals refer to it as the doorpost. While spring and summer pageants involve decorating and dancing around the stone, parents forbid their children from spending time near it when the moon is full. One well-respected and otherwise reasonable old man claimed. Sim broke off reading. Whatever, he said disgustedly, and moved to close the book. Claimed what? Willem asked, his curiosity piqued. Simon rolled his eyes and continued reading. Claimed at certain times men could pass through the stone door into the fair land where Felurian herself abides, loving and destroying men with her embrace. Interesting, Willem murmured. No, it isn't. It's childish, superstitious bunk, Simon said testily. And none of this is getting us any closer to deciding who is right. How do you count them, Will?
Good.
I asked. You're our impartial judge. Willem moved to the table and looked through the books. His dark eyebrows moved up and down as he considered. 7 for Simon, 6 for Kvothe, 3 contrary. We looked briefly at the 4 books I had brought. Willem ruled one of them out, which brought the tally to 7 for Simon and 10 for me. Hardly conclusive, Willem mused. We could declare it a draw, I suggested magnanimously. Simmons scowled. Good-natured or not, he hated losing a bet. Fair enough, he said.
Well, that's who that was.
I turned to Willem and gave a significant look at the pair of books still untouched on the table. It looks like our bet will be settled a little more quickly, yeah? Willem gave a predatory grin. Very quickly. He lifted a book. Here I have a copy of the proclamation which disbanded the Emir. He opened to a marked page and began to read. Directions will henceforth be held in account by the laws of the Empire. No member of the Order shall presume to take upon themselves the right to hear a case, nor to pass judgment in court. He looked up smugly. See? If they had their adjudicating powers revoked, then they must have had some to begin with. So, it stands to reason they were a part of the Aetoran bureaucracy. Actually, I said apologetically, the Church has always had judiciary powers in Aetur. I held up one of my 2 books. It's funny
you ever
you
tried
should
4-3?
bring the Alpura Prolitka Emir. I brought it too.
That
The
shit's
decree itself was
broken.
issued by the church. Willem's expression
4-3?
darkened. No, it wasn't.
You play 4-3.
It
and
was
then you put
listed
your,
in
like,
here
2x
as
to
Emperor
4.
Nalto's
It's just like your
63rd
1x is
decree.
4-3. It's so broken.
Puzzled, we compared our two
Like
books
Iron
and
Sight
found
1x
them
is
directly
like-
contradictory.
It's like a aimbot. Once you get
Well,
on target, you just can't.
I guess those
like, it's
cancel
like
each
really
other
hard to get
out,
off target.
Sim said. What else have you guys got? This is Feltemi Race's The Lights of History.
But it's like you 4-3,
Willem grumbled.
and then you go your per
It is
optics, and you can change
definitive.
Stuff to like
I didn't
4
think
or
I would
5.
need any further
It's weird
proof.
how the Apex like sense shit works.
Doesn't this bother either of you? I thumped the two contradictory books with a knuckle.
So you're
These shouldn't be saying different things. We
then
just
you'd have
read
to go
20
your per
books
optics,
saying
right?
different things, Simon pointed out. Why would I have a problem with 2 more? The purpose of the Greystones is speculative. There's bound to be a variety of opinions. But the Alpura Prolitka Emir was an open decree. It turned thousands of the most powerful men and women in the Aturan Empire into outlaws.
I hit one for
It was one of the
120.
primary
This guy's hit
reasons for the
120.
collapse of the Empire. There's no reason for conflicting information. The Order has been disbanded for over 300 years, Simon said. Plenty of time for some contradictions to arise.
LG.
I shook my head, flipping through both of the books.
Pro team.
Contrary opinions are one thing. Contrary facts are another. I held up my book. This is The Fall of Empire by Gregor the Lesser.
I'll come grab it.
He's a windbag and a bigot, but he's the best historian of his age. I held up Willem's book. Faltimi Race isn't nearly the historian, but he's twice the scholar Gregor was and scrupulous about his
Probably one of
facts.
the only,
I looked back and
like,
forth
games
between the
where,
books,
like,
frowning.
pro teams
This
stack.
doesn't make any sense.
Oh, yeah, I
So
didn't
what
even-
now? Sim said. Another
Like,
draw?
do full pro teams
That's
stack in other
disappointing.
games when they play ranked?
We need someone to judge,
Yeah, they guess they
Willem
all
said.
do.
A higher authority. Higher than Faltimi Rice? I asked. I doubt Lauren can be bothered to settle our bet. Will shook his head, then stood and brushed the wrinkles from the front of his shirt.
Never liked it.
It means you finally get to meet Puppet.
Not coming from Halo.
Chapter 40.
Yeah.
Puppet. The most important thing is to be polite, Simmons said in a hushed tone as we made our way through a narrow hallway lined with books. Our sympathy lamps shot bands of light through the shelves and made the shadows dance nervously.
Yeah,
But don't patronize him. He's a bit
thought it was just me.
odd. But he's not an idiot.
I'm like,
Just treat him like you would treat anyone else. Except polite, I said
You're the seer?
sarcastically, tiring
Yeah,
of
I
this
feel bad.
litany of advice.
I
Exactly,
actually don't know. All I know
Simmons
is
said
you want to be
seriously.
hero.
Where are we going anyway? I asked,
I don't
mostly
know what
to
it
stop
does,
Simmons
I just know that you
henpecking.
don't like it.
Sub 3,
that's funny.
Willem said as he turned to descend a long flight of stone steps. Centuries of use had worn down the stone, making the stairs look as bowed as heavy-laden shelves. As we started down, the shadows made the steps look smooth and dark and edgeless, like an abandoned riverbed worn from the rock.
Oh, I'm back.
Are you sure he's going to be there?
I'm good now.
Will nodded. I don't think he leaves his chambers very much. Chambers?
160, so
I
can bunny
asked.
hop.
He lives here? Neither of them said anything as Willem led the way down another flight of stairs, then through a long stretch of wide hallway with a low ceiling.
You can really
Finally,
bunny
we
hop.
came to an unremarkable door tucked into a corner. If I hadn't known better, I would have assumed it was one of the countless reading holes scattered throughout the stacks.
Like, the whole bunny
Just
hop
don't
thing is
do
really
anything to
fun
upset
with
him,
controller. If you
Simmons
play
said
144,
nervously.
It bugs. If you play 140,
I assumed
bunny hop,
my
if you
most
play
polite
160,
expression
or
as
if you
Willem
play
rapped on the
150
door.
above, you can bunny hop. It's just,
The handle began to turn almost immediately. The door opened a crack, then was thrown wide. Puppet stood framed in the doorway, taller than
really
any
what
of
it
us.
looks like.
The sleeves of his black robe billowed strikingly in the breeze of the opening door.
I don't really know
He
what it
stared
looks
at us
like. I don't
haughtily
think so.
for a
I don't
moment,
think that's
then
what
looked
that is.
puzzled, and brought a hand to touch the side of his
Whatever I'm
head.
doing right there was bunny hopping. But
Wait, I forgot my hood, he said, and kicked the door closed. Odd as his brief appearance had been, I'd noticed something more disturbing.
They have double charge.
Burn body
I'm
of God, I whispered. He's got candles in there.
They have triple charge.
Does Lauren know?
No, they're
Sim
triple
opened
charge.
his mouth
They're
to
triple
answer
charge.
when the
They're
door was
triple
thrown
charge.
wide
They're
again.
triple charge rifle, no bullshit.
Puppet filled the doorway, his dark robe striking against the warm candlelight behind him. He was hooded now, with his arms upraised. The long sleeves of his robes caught the inrush of air and billowed impressively. The same rush of air caught his hood and blew it partway off his head. "Damn," he said in a distracted voice. The hood settled half on, half off his head, partially covering one eye. He kicked the door shut again.
It's a bloodhound.
Willem and Sim remained straight-faced.
Maybe?
I refrained from any comment. There was a moment of quiet. Finally, a muffled voice came from the other side of the door.
I've only heard the head.
"Would you mind knocking again? It doesn't seem quite right otherwise." Obediently, Willem stepped back up to the door and knocked.
That's convenient.
Once, twice, then the door swung open, and we were confronted with a looming figure in a dark robe. His cowled hood shadowed his face, and the long sleeves of his robe stirred in the wind. "Who calls on Taborlin the Great?" Puppet intoned, his voice resonant but slightly muted by the deep hood. A hand pointed dramatically. "You, Simon!" There was a pause, and his voice lost its dramatic resonance. "I've seen you already today, haven't I?"
Oh.
I'm gonna watch this shit.
Sim nodded. I could sense the laughter tumbling around in him, trying to find a way out.
Shit on me bad.
"How long
Oh,
ago?"
yeah, he's cheating.
"About an hour." The hood nodded. "Was I better this time?" He reached up to push the hood back, and I noticed the robe was too big for him, the sleeves hanging down to his fingertips. When his face emerged from the hood, he was grinning like a child playing dress-up in his parents' clothes. "You weren't doing Taborlin before," Simon admitted. "Oh." Puppet seemed a little put out. "How was I this time?" "The last time, I mean. Was it a good Taborlin?"
Fight in a corner.
"Pretty good,"
Wait, they're gonna
Simon
lose.
said. Puppet looked at Willem.
They know we're spectating.
"I liked
No,
the
fuck
robe,
they didn't. This Pathfinder
Will
was sitting
said.
in a corner the whole time.
but I always imagined Taborlin with a gentle voice." "Oh,"
I'd hope so.
he finally looked at me.
To be bad.
Their ass.
"Hello."
I'm over that shit.
"Hello," I said in my politest tone. "I don't know you." A pause.
I couldn't. You guys
"Who are you?"
Guy was shitting bricks, dude.
"I'm Quoth,"
Like how the Pathfinder was just
"You
in
seem
the
so certain of
garage
it,"
thing the entire
he
time.
said, looking at me intently.
Yeah, he hit
Another
it
pause.
He hit it 2 times on that fucking...
"They call me Puppet."
Nut as well.
"Who is they?"
I was
"Who
wondering why I
are
died.
they?" he corrected, raising a finger.
Yeah, you
I smiled.
exploded.
"Who are they, then?"
Goddamn time.
"Who
It was
were
the fucking
they, then?"
Bloodhound, bro. The Bloodhound.
"Who are they
the
now?"
Bloodhound just
I
fried my
clarified,
shit.
my smile growing wider. Puppet mirrored my smile in a distracted way and made a vague gesture with one hand. "You know, them. People." He continued to stare at me the same way I might examine an interesting stone or a type of leaf I'd never seen before.
And sometime
"What do you call
alone,
yourself?" I asked.
Something about something.
He seemed a little surprised, and his eyes focused onto me in a more ordinary way. "That would be telling, I suspect," he said with a touch of reproach. He glanced at the silent Willem
Right, that
and
game doesn't
Simon.
count.
"You
You
should
won
come
3
in now."
games. That one doesn't count.
He turned and walked inside. The room
One
wasn't
and then we died.
particularly large, but it seemed bizarrely out of place, nestled in the belly of the archives. There was a deep padded chair, a large wooden table, and a pair of doorways leading into other rooms. Books were everywhere, overflowing shelves and bookcases. They were piled on the floor, scattered across tables, and stacked on chairs. A pair of drawn curtains against one wall surprised me. My mind struggled with the impression that there must be a window behind them, despite the fact that I knew we were deep underground. The room was lit with lamps and candles, long tapers and thick dripping pillars of wax. Each tongue of flame filled me with vague anxiety as I thought of open fire in a building filled with hundreds of thousands of precious books. And there were puppets.
I'm just so excited.
They
to
hung
play
from
tomorrow.
shelves and pegs on walls. They lay crumpled in corners and under chairs. Some were in the process of being built or repaired, scattered among tools across the tabletop. There were shelves full of figurines, each cleverly carved and painted in the shape of a person.
Ooh, dinner's ready.
On his way to his table, Puppet shrugged out of the black robe and let it fall carelessly to the floor. He was dressed plainly underneath, wrinkled white shirt, wrinkled dark pants, and mismatched socks much mended in the heel. I realized he was older than I'd thought. His face was smooth and unlined, but his hair was pure white and thin on top. Puppet cleared a chair for me, carefully removing a small string puppet from the seat and finding it a place on a nearby shelf. He then took a seat at the table, leaving Willem and Simon standing. To their credit, they didn't seem terribly disconcerted.
All right, relax.
Digging a little in the clutter on the table, he brought out an irregularly shaped piece of wood and a small knife.
It's not like the new attitude.
He took another long, searching look at my face, then began to methodically whittle curls of wood falling onto the tabletop.
That's fucking crazy.
Oddly enough, I had no desire to ask anyone what was going on.
That's crazy.
When you ask as many questions as I do,
No.
you learn when they are appropriate.
I'm not on a team right now.
Besides, I knew what the answers would be.
What does that mean?
Puppet was one of the talented, not quite sane people who had found a niche for themselves at the university.
Me and the tripod.
Arcanum training does unnatural things to students' minds. The most notable of these unnatural things is the ability to do what most people call magic, and we call sympathy, sigildry, alchemy, naming, and the like. Some minds take to it easily, others have difficulty. The worst of these go mad and end up in Haven. But most minds don't shatter when subjected to the stress of the Arcanum. They simply crack a little. Sometimes these cracks showed in small ways. Facial tics, stuttering. Other students heard voices, grew forgetful, went blind, went dumb. Sometimes it was only for an hour or a day. Sometimes it was forever. I guessed Puppet was a student who had cracked years ago. Like Ari, he seemed to have found a place for himself, though I marveled at the fact that Lauren let him live down here. Does he always look like this? Puppet asked Willem and Simon. A small drift of pale wood shavings had gathered around his hands.
I killed one.
Mostly, Willem said. Like what? Simon asked. Like he's just thought through his next 3 moves in a game of tyranny and figured out how he's going to beat you. Puppet took another long look at my face and shaved another thin strip of wood away. It's rather irritating, really. Willem barked a laugh. That's his thinking face, Puppet. He wears it a lot, but not all the time.
Attitude is just more that I feel.
What's
like, I feel
tyranny?
Like awake today, and
Simon
when I
asked.
feel awake, I play good, and when I play good, I'm
thinker,
happy because I'm playing good.
Puppet
you know?
mused.
It's like a cascade.
What are you
effect,
thinking now?
where,
I'm
like,
thinking you
when I'm
must be a
sleepy, I'm
very
not playing
careful
good.
watcher of
Nothing.
people, Puppet, I said politely. Puppet snorted without looking up. What use is care? What good is watching, for that matter? People are forever watching things.
Well, in this game.
They should be seeing. I see the things I look at. I am a seer.
My guy.
He looked at the piece of wood in his hand, then to my face. Apparently satisfied, he folded his hands over the top of his carving, but not before I glimpsed my own profile cunningly wrought in wood.
Scared us.
Do you know what you have been, what you are not, and what you will be? He asked. It sounded like a riddle. No.
Slenderman scares me.
A
Dude,
seer,
this is looted, by the way.
he said with certainty. Because that is what Ilir means.
Why landed there, bro?
Kvothe is actually a Relar, Simon said respectfully. Puppet sniffed disparagingly.
That's a good loadout.
Hardly, he said, looking at me closely. You might be a seer
It
eventually,
used to, not so
but
much
not
anymore.
yet. Now, you're a looker. You'll be a true Ilir
When,
at some
Gibi
point,
was a thing,
if you learn to
almost everything
relax.
was massive, and you
He
needed a
held out the
shotgun.
carved wooden face. What do you see
Especially
here?
now, like, if you're on Horizon,
It was no longer an irregular piece of wood.
I actually don't even think
My
the scouts are
features,
great on Horizon,
locked
but
in
we-
serious contemplation, stared out of the wood grain. I leaned forward to get a closer look. Puppet laughed and threw up his hands. Too late!
Yeah.
He exclaimed, looking childlike for a moment.
You ever seen
You looked too hard and didn't see enough. Too much looking can get in the way of seeing, you see?
Herman Miller.
Puppet set the carved face on the tabletop so it seemed to be staring at one of the recumbent puppets.
What's his name? Wait, what is that?
See, little wooden
Yeah.
Kvothe? See him looking? So intent. So
Use
dedicated. He'll look for 100 years, but will he ever see what's in front of him? Puppet settled back in his seat, his eyes wandering the room in a contented way. Ilir means seer? Simon asked.
Take him out.
Do the other ranks mean things too? As a student with full access to the archives, I imagine you can find that out for yourself,
Yeah,
Puppet said. His attention focused on a puppet on the table in front of him.
clear.
He lowered it to the floor carefully to avoid tangling
Like,
its
they just
strings.
zip on in the back.
It was a perfect miniature of a gray-robed Talon priest.
They just
Would you have any advice as to where he could start looking? I asked, playing a hunch. Renfelcu's dictum.
40?
Under Puppet's direction, the Talon puppet raised himself from the floor and moved each of his limbs as if he were stretching after a long sleep. I'm not familiar with that one. Puppet responded in a distracted voice.
I killed the Valk.
It's on the second floor in the southeast corner. Second row, second rack, third shelf, right-hand side, red leather binding. The miniature Talon priest walked slowly around Puppet's feet. Clutched tightly in one hand was a tiny replica of the Book of the
I
Path,
only use
perfectly
one
fashioned, right down to the tiny
have four, but I
spoked
only use
wheel
one.
painted on the cover. The three of us watched Puppet pull the strings of the little
I use
priest,
the instant
making it
cross
walk
that comes
back
with
and
four, but I
forth
only use one
before
at a time.
finally coming to sit on one of Puppet's stocking-clad feet.
Like that one feels better than like the
Willem cleared his throat
Yeah,
respectfully.
this one's more like a button rather than like
Puppet?
a paddle.
Yes?
It's nice.
Puppet replied without looking up from his feet.
I actually
You have a
just
question?
DM'd
Or rather,
One of, like,
Quoth
the-
has a question, and you're thinking of asking it
like
for
that.
him.
He'd try to get a sponsorship.
He's sitting slightly forward in his
He
seat.
responded.
There's a furrow between
He
his
said-
brows,
he said
and a
yes,
pursing
but
of the lips that gives it
talked to
away.
him about it. I wanna
Let
get it
him
out
ask
here,
me.
though.
It
Wanna
might
try
do
it
him
out.
good.
On the staircase right in front of me.
I froze in place,
I basically
catching
cracked
myself
his
doing
jaw.
each of the things he had mentioned.
Hit him like 95.
Puppet continued to work the strings of his little Talon.
Nah, that's a hard push. We could Valkyrie
It made a
for-
careful, fearful search of the area
Nah,
around
fuck
his
that.
feet, brandishing the book in front of itself before stepping around table legs and peering into Puppet's abandoned shoes. Its movements were uncanny, and it distracted me to the point where I forgot I was uncomfortable and felt myself relax.
That's another whole ass team, though. might
I was
see-
wondering about the Emir, actually.
What the fuck?
My eyes remained on the scene unfolding
Yeah,
at
I'm just
Puppet's
lying
feet.
back here.
Another marionette had joined the show, a young girl in a peasant dress. She approached the Talon and held out a hand as if trying to give him something. No, she was
Yeah, our
asking him a
Valkyries are
question.
different.
The Talon turned his back on her. She laid a timid hand on his arm. He took a haughty step away.
that one.
26 flash.
I was wondering who
Who's he
disbanded
shot at?
them,
Here.
Emperor
I
Nalto
don't see
or the
anybody there.
church. Still looking. He admonished more gently than before.
Oh, the charter?
You need to go chase the wind for a while.
The guys
You're too
behind us gotta
serious.
move.
It will lead you into trouble.
Ooh.
The Talon suddenly turned on the girl. Trembling with rage, it menaced her with the book. She took a startled step backward and stumbled to her knees.
At least two.
The church disbanded them, of course. Only an edict from the pontifex had the ability to affect them. The Talon struck the girl with the book, once, twice, driving her to the ground where she lay terribly still. Nalto couldn't have told them to cross to the other side of the street. Some slight motion drew Puppet's eye. Oh, dear me, he said, cocking his head toward Willem.
Yeah, they went to market.
See
though.
what I see. The head bows slightly, the jaw clenches, but the eyes aren't fixed on anything, aiming the irritation inward. If I were the sort of person who judged by looking, I'd guess Willem had just lost a bet. Don't you know the church frowns on gambling? At Puppet's
guys
feet,
came back.
the priest brandished the book upward at Willem. The Talon brought its hands together and turned away from the crumpled woman. It took a stately step or two away and bowed its head as if praying. I managed to pull my attention away from the tableau and look up at our host.
Dude, no way that those
Puppet?
guys are still there.
I asked, "Have you read The Lights of History by Faltemi Rice?" I saw Simon give
Yeah,
Willem
one's
an
dead,
anxious
one's
look,
dead.
but Puppet didn't seem to find anything odd about the question. The Talon at his feet stood and started to dance and caper about.
In front of us.
Yes? Why would Rice say the Apura Prolicia Emir was Emperor Nalto's 63rd decree? Rice wouldn't say any such thing, Puppet said without looking up from the marionette at his feet. That's pure nonsense. But we found a copy of Lights that said exactly that, I pointed out. Puppet shrugged, watching the Talon dance at his feet.
What's up, barbarian?
It could be a transcription mistake, Willem mused. Depending on the edition of the book, the church itself might be responsible for changing that piece of information. Emperor Nalto is history's favorite whipping boy. It could be the church trying to distance itself from the Emir. They did some terrible things
Race-
toward
it's a
the
Race
end.
Watson team.
Clever, clever,
Low-key, bro, I'm about to
Puppet
just, I'm
said.
about to just walk up.
At his feet, the Talon made a sweeping bow in Willem's direction.
Oh, these are acid.
I was struck by a sudden idea.
Get on the roof.
Puppet.
Get on the roof. Get on the roof.
I asked,
Get on the roof, and then you can...
do you know what is behind the locked door on the floor above this one? The large stone door?
Outside of the building, though.
The Talon stopped dancing, and Puppet looked up. He gave me a long, stern look. His eyes were serious and clear. I don't think the 4-plate door should be of any concern to a student. Do you? I felt myself flush.
Dude.
No,
this is
sir.
Stupid.
I looked away from his eyes. The tension of the moment was broken by the distant sound of the belling tower. Simon cursed softly. I'm late, he said. I'm sorry, Puppet. I've got to go. Puppet stood and hung the Talon on the wall. It's time I got back to my reading, regardless, he said. He moved to the padded chair, sat, and opened a book. Bring this one back sometime. He gestured in my direction without looking up from his book. I have some more work to do on him. Chapter 41, The Greater Good.
Jesus.
I looked up at Simon and whispered, Ivari enim yuge. Sim gave a despairing sigh.
Like a
You are supposed to be studying your physiognomy.
wasn't
It
even
had been
the
a
same
full
team.
span since we had set fire to Ambrose's rooms, and winter was finally showing its teeth, covering the university with knee-deep drifts of blowing snow.
Dude, that team in that building.
As was always the case when the weather turned inclement, the archives were full to the brim with industrious students. Since all the reading holes were occupied, Simon and I had been forced to bring our books to tomes. The high-ceilinged, windowless room was more than half full today, but still quiet as a
You probably
crypt.
could've broke it, though.
All the dark stone and muted whispers made the place slightly eerie, making it obvious why students referred to it as
Yeah,
tombs.
shoot the top.
I
I'm
am
pretty sure you
studying
can
my
punch it twice.
physiognomy.
Almost
I
everything in
protested
this game,
softly.
if you punch it, it
I was looking at some of Gibeah's
Like, you know
diagrams.
Newcastle wall? You could
Look what I
punch it
found.
twice.
I held out a book for him to see.
Yeah, if you punch it twice,
Gibeah,
you break it
Simon
instantly.
whispered, horrified.
Same with, like,
I
Rampart
swear,
walls.
the only reason you
If
study
you
with
punch
me
them,
is so
they
you can
break.
interrupt. He pulled away from the book I was offering him. It's nothing
Dude,
grotesque,
sometimes, like,
I
Canyon
protested.
turns into ape,
Just
like zombies real
Here,
quick.
just look at what it says here. Simon
okay.
shoved the book away, and my temper flared. Careful! I hissed. This is one of his originals. I found it behind some
Yeah,
other
that's about
books
it.
buried in
Bunch.
dead ledgers. Lauren will cut off my thumbs if anything happens to it. Sim recoiled from the book as if it were red hot. An original? Merciful Taylor, it's probably written on human skin! Get it away from me! I almost joked about how human skin probably wouldn't take ink, but decided against it when I saw the expression on Sim's face. Still, my expression must have given me away. You're perverse, he spat, his voice almost rising to unacceptable levels. God's mother! Don't you know he cut apart living men to watch their organs work? I refuse to look at anything that monster was responsible for. I set the book down. You might as well give up studying medicine then, I said as gently as possible. Gibeah's research on the human body was the most thorough ever done. His journals are the backbone of modern physics. Simon's face stayed hard, and he leaned forward so he could speak softly and still be heard. When the Emir moved against the Duke, they found the bones of 20,000 people. Great pits of bones and ashes. Women and children. 20,000! Simon sputtered a bit before he could continue. And those are just the ones they found. I let him calm himself a bit before I said, Gibeah wrote 23 volumes concerning the machinery of the body. I pointed out as gently as I could. When the Emir moved against him, part of his estate burned. 4 of those volumes and all his notes were lost. Ask Master Arwill what he would give to have those volumes whole again. Simon brought his hand down hard on the tabletop, causing several students to look in our direction. Damn it, he hissed. I grew up 30 miles from Gibeah. From my father's hills, you can see the ruins on a cloudless day.
I want to just take this pad and go to the...
That stilled me. If Sim's family lands were that close, his ancestors must have been fealty-bound to Gibeah. That meant they might have been forced to help him gather subjects for his experiments. Some of his family might have ended up in the pits of bone and ash themselves. I waited a long while before I whispered again. I didn't know.
You have a whole ass team on
He
you.
regained most of his composure. We don't talk about it, he said stiffly, brushing the hair out of his eyes.
It's the best gun in the game.
We bent to our studies, and it was an hour before Simmons spoke again.
Bullshit then, dude.
For 1v1?
What did you find? He asked, too casually,
Yeah, best
as if
gun in the
not
game.
wanting to admit his curiosity. Here, on the
Once you,
inner
like,
leaf,
learn how to
I
use
whispered
it, it's
excitedly.
broken.
I opened the cover and Sim's face twisted unconsciously as he looked down at the page, as if the book smelled of death.
Good spot.
Spilled
That's
it
a good
all
priority on that.
over. I heard a voice as a pair of older students strolled into the hall. By their rich clothes, I could tell they were both nobility, and while they weren't shouting, they weren't making any effort
But,
to
like,
be
you just,
quiet
you
either.
Just, like, learn the lead, like...
Anisette made him clear up the mess before he let him wash off. He'll smell like urea for a span of days.
Wait,
What's here to see?
from behind.
Simon asked,
Like that.
looking down at the page. It's just his name and the dates,
Stay closer.
Yeah, they're walking down.
not the middle. Look up at the top, around the edges of the
Team is running
page.
at us, by the way. Those
I
other teams
pointed
running
at the
us.
decorative
From
scroll
behind.
work,
Flash.
right there.
75 cracks on another.
I'd wager a drab the little pug poisons himself before the term's through, the other one said.
I could get that.
Were we ever that stupid?
This other team behind us was...
I still don't see
was
anything,
I don't know what
Simmons said softly, making a baffled gesture with both his elbows on the table.
340.
It's pretty enough if you like that sort of thing, but I've never been a great fan of illuminated text. We could head to the Two-Penny. The conversation continued several tables away, drawing annoyed looks from surrounding students.
Purchase.
They've got a girl there who plays the pipes.
70/1.
I swear, you've never seen anything like her before. And Linton says if you've got a bit of silver, she... His voice dropped conspiratorially.
Sprinted at us from behind.
She what?
We had no loot.
I asked, butting into their conversation as rudely as possible. I didn't need to shout. In the tomes, a normal speaking voice carries the whole room. I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that last bit. The two of them gave me affronted looks, but didn't reply. What are you
Why do they
doing?
have to have an iron
Sim
sight
hissed at
here
me,
when they were
embarrassed.
pushing?
I'm trying to shut them up,
Wait, what's a Peter?
I said.
Repeater.
Just ignore them,
Oh.
he said. Here, I'm looking at your damn book.
That Peter.
Show me what you want me to
I did say
see.
Peter.
Oh, you just called.
Gibeah sketched all his own journals, I said. This is his original,
hate that gun.
so
That
it
gun
makes
sucks.
sense that he did his own scroll work too, right?
I swear that's the worst.
Sim nodded
The
and
Peter-
brushed his
I
hair
hate
back
it
from
the
his eyes.
If you have like a 2
What
to
do you
4
see
on it,
there?
and, like,
I slowly
I guess,
pointed
like,
from
I
one
don't-
piece of
use that
scroll
gun.
work to another.
You gotta learn it. You gotta
Do you
like,
see
learn
it?
the lead on that gun. I hate it. though.
Sim
I
shook
hate
his
that
head.
gun.
I pointed again, more precisely. There,
To me, that's
I
just
said.
the worst gun in the game.
And
That
there in the
fucking
corner.
Spitfire.
Nah,
His eyes widened.
beginning of the game right there, and I didn't-
Letters!
I wasn't even fucking close. I'm not even-
I,
What? This,
V?
the
I
Peter?
was nowhere. Yes. I
he
was
paused to
nowhere
puzzle
close.
them out.
It feels like
Ivari
it-
Enemuge.
Shot it did not go well.
That's what you were rambling
I
about.
swear, dude, the same shit with me. I didn't.
He
I
pushed
don't
the
think I
book
hit a bullet
away.
with the Peter.
So what's the point, aside from the fact that he was nearly illiterate in Temic? It's not
I should
Temic,
have picked up the wing.
I pointed out.
I just had a heavy
It's
mag for my
Tima,
Peter, so I was like, fuck it.
an
I'm gonna
archaic
grab
usage.
this.
One team.
No,
What is
it's
it
over
even
here.
supposed to say?
I'm gonna go down here solo.
He looked up from
you
his
got
book,
that.
his brow creasing. Toward great good? I shook my head. For greater good, I corrected.
Yeah, Shotzi, I got you.
Sound familiar?
Oh, hell.
I don't know how long she'll be there,
Shot that gun, didn't
one of the loud pair continued.
The only fucking
If you
gun
miss
I
her,
found.
you'll regret it. I told you, I can't tonight.
Or the-
Maybe on Felling.
Havoc
I'll be
is
free on Felling.
broken.
Havoc.
You should go before then,
Not pick it up.
I told him. The Two Pennies crowded Felling
It's a
night.
controller player. I don't know.
They
You gotta
gave
use
me
that shit as a-
irritated looks.
The thing with that gun, though, is
Mind
you
your
gotta
own
use it as
business,
SMG, not like
Slipstick,
a-
the taller
not
one
like an
said.
AR. You
That
gotta
got
use
my
it as
back up
SMG.
even more.
Has a controller
I'm sorry, weren't you
Yeah.
talking to me? Did it look like I was talking to you?
If
He
you
said
can hear it,
scathingly.
That's different.
No,
It sounded like it, I said. If I can hear you 3 tables away, you must want me to be part of your conversation. I cleared my throat.
2 or 3.
The only alternative is that you're too thick to keep your voice down in the tomes.
Oh, I'm gonna
Right there.
ask God.
His face flushed red, and he probably would have replied, but his friend said something in his
Wait, do
ear,
you have a-
and they
do you have
both
an
gathered their
instrument?
books and left.
Me now.
There was a quiet
Oh, there's a
scattering of
problem.
applause as the door closed behind them. I gave my audience a smile and a wave.
I don't have a turbocharger for this shot.
The Scrivs would have taken care of that, Sim reproached softly as we leaned back over the table to talk.
There you go. I'll find
The
it.
Scrivs weren't taking care of it, I pointed out.
Okay, I want that.
Besides, it's quiet again, and that's what matters. Now,
Ooh, need that.
what does for greater good remind you of?
Yep.
The Amir, of course, he said.
Good.
It's always the Amir with
There
you
was
lately.
So much energy. Emma.
What's your point?
Some purple energy, Meg.
The point, I whispered excitedly, is that Gibeah was a secret member of the Order Amir.
What about you?
Sim gave me a skeptical look.
Really?
That's a
Might be
bit of a
stolen.
stretch, but I suppose it fits. That was about 50
years.
years before they were denounced by the church.
I think cars like
They were
just
pretty
don't go to
corrupt
the
by
back.
then. I wanted to point out that Gibeah wasn't necessarily corrupt.
Like default.
He was pursuing the Amir's purpose, the greater good. While his experiments had been horrifying, his work advanced medicine in ways it was almost impossible to comprehend. His work had probably saved 10 times that many lives in the hundreds of years since.
Actually, I would
However,
say it is
I doubted Sim would appreciate my point.
No, it's
Corrupt or not, he was a secret member of the Amir. Why else would he hide their credo in the front cover of his journal? Simon shrugged.
Two mag types.
Fine, he was one of the Amir. What does that have to do with the price of butter?
Our player is just here
I threw up my hands in frustration and struggled to keep my voice low.
as much
That means the Order had secret members before the Church denounced them. That means when the Pontifex disbanded them, the Amir had hidden allies. Allies that could keep them safe. That means the Amir could still exist today, in secret, pursuing their work in subtle ways. I noticed a change in Simmons' face.
One's
At first,
crossing, one's on the
I thought he
rooftop,
was
and
about
one's
to
on the
agree
right.
with me. Then I felt a prickle on the back of my neck and realized the truth. "Hello, Master Lauren," I greeted him respectfully, without turning around. "Speaking with students at other tables is not permitted," he said from behind me. "You are suspended for 5 days." I nodded, and the two of us came to our feet and gathered up our things. Expressionless, Master Lauren reached out a long hand toward me. I handed Gibeah's journal over without comment, and a minute later, we were blinking in the chill winter sunlight outside the archive's doors. I pulled my cloak around me and stomped the snow off my feet.
You guys gotta watch for me.
"Suspended,"
I'm on skate.
Simmons said. "That was clever."
Kill one.
I shrugged, more embarrassed than I cared to admit. I hoped one of the other students would explain I was actually trying to keep things quiet, rather than the other way around. I was just trying to do the right thing.
I got his kill. I got his
Simon laughed as we began to walk slowly in the direction of anchors.
Use my shield, use my shield.
He kicked playfully at a small drift of snow. "The world needs people like you," Simon said, in the tone of voice that let me know he was turning
I
philosophical.
killed 2 on this team.
You get things done. Not always the best way or the most sensible way, but it gets done nonetheless. You're a rare creature. "How do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued.
He's running, bro.
Sim shrugged.
as far as
"Like today,
Where the other guys
something
are?
bothers you. Someone offends you, and suddenly you're off." He made a quick motion with a flat hand. "You know exactly what to do. You never hesitate. You just see and react." He was thoughtful for a moment. "I imagine that's the way the Amir used to be.
I might just, like, run
Small
wingman
wonder
for a
folk
while.
were frightened
Use
of
it
them.
again. Haven't
I'm
run
not
this
always
in a
so
long time.
terribly sure of myself," I admitted.
I'm definitely
Simmons
watching
smiled.
the wingman, that's for sure.
"I find that strangely reassuring."
I can just run anything.
Chapter 42. Penance. Since studying wasn't an option, and winter was covering everything in drifts of blowing snow, I decided this was the perfect time to catch up on a few things I'd been letting fall by the
I can
wayside.
probably craft here until I get my
I tried to pay Ari a visit, but ice covered the rooftops, and the courtyard where we usually met was full of drifted snow.
I guess I should have
I was glad I didn't see any footprints, as I didn't think Ari owned shoes, let alone a coat or hat. I would have gone searching for her in the underthing, but the iron grate in the courtyard was locked and iced over.
I don't.
I worked a few double shifts in the Medica and played an extra night at Anchors as an apology for the evening when I'd had to leave early.
Fucking.
I worked long hours in the fishery, calculating, running tests, and casting alloys for my project. I also made a point of catching up on a month of lost sleep. But there is only so much sleeping one person can do, and by the 4th day of my suspension, I'd run out of excuses.
Remember the alcohol glitch?
As much as I didn't want to, I needed
We
to
used
talk
like,
to
go
Davy.
under the map.
By the time I made up my mind to go, the weather had warmed just enough so that the falling snow had turned to sheets of freezing sleet.
Some guy ended up in like a.
It was a miserable walk to Imre. I didn't have hat or gloves, and the wind-driven sleet soaked my cloak within 5 minutes. In 10 minutes, I was wet through to the skin and wishing I'd waited or spent the money on a carriage. The sleet had melted the snow on the road, and the damp slush was inches
You're
thick.
good.
I stopped by the Aeolian to warm myself a bit before heading to Davy's, but the building was locked and lightless for the first time I'd ever seen. Small wonder. What noble would come out in this weather? What musician would expose their instrument to the freezing damp? So, I slogged my way through the deserted streets, eventually coming to the alley behind the butcher's shop. It was the first time I could remember the stairway not smelling of rancid fat. I knocked on Davy's door, alarmed by how numb my hand was. I could barely feel my knuckles hitting the door.
I'm watching.
I waited for a long moment, then knocked again, worried that she might not be in, and I'd come all this way for nothing. The door opened just a little. Warm lamplight and a single icy blue eye peered out through the crack. Then the door opened wide. "Taylor's tits and teeth," Davy said. "What are you doing out in this?" I thought, "No, you didn't,"
Not bad.
she said disparagingly. "Get in here."
Last couple
I
have been a
stepped
little
inside,
rough,
dripping,
I just
the hood
realized.
of my cloak plastered to my
Gone out a
head.
little bit, but not
She closed the door behind me, then locked and bolted it. Looking around, I noticed she'd added a second bookshelf, though it was still mostly bare. I shifted my weight, and a great mass of damp slush dislodged itself from my cloak and splattered wetly onto the floor. Davy gave me a long, dispassionate looking over. I could see a fire crackling in the grate on the other side of the room near her desk, but she made no indication that I should come any farther into the room, so I remained where I was, dripping and shivering. "You never do things the easy way, do you?" she said. "There's an easy way?"
that much off.
I asked.
Then again, we had
She
4
didn't
months,
laugh.
basically.
"If you think showing up here half frozen and looking like a kicked dog is going to improve my disposition toward you, you're terribly—"
When did
She
you
trailed
have
off and looked at me
people fill
thoughtfully for another
non-land
long
teams?
moment.
Yeah, basically like
"I'll
5,
be
6 months of
damned,"
non-land teams.
she said, sounding surprised. "I actually do like seeing you like this. It's lifting my spirits to an almost irritating degree."
Why do you
"It
not?
wasn't really my intention," I said, "but I'll take it.
No,
Would it help if I
depends.
caught a terrible
I
cold?"
don't like use it because it's kind of inconsistent.
Davy considered it. "It might," she admitted. "Penance does involve a certain amount of
That's
suffering."
also another thing that's
I
dependent on
nodded,
frame rate.
not having to work
I
to
don't know
look
if you know that.
miserable.
Yeah.
I dug
Lower
into
the
my
frame rate,
purse
the
with
easier it
clumsy
is.
fingers and brought out a small bronze coin I'd won off Sim playing low-stakes breath several nights ago. Davy took it. "A penance piece," she said, unimpressed. "Is this supposed to be symbolic?" I shrugged, causing more slush to spatter to the floor. "Somewhat," I said. "I thought of going to a money changer and settling my entire debt with you in penance
Yeah,
coin."
they did.
"What stopped you?" she asked. "I realized it would just irritate you," I said, "and I wasn't looking forward to paying the money changer's fee."
Go the other way.
I fought the urge to looking longingly at the fireplace. I've spent a lot of time trying to think of some gesture that might make a suitable apology to you. "You decided it would be best to walk here during the worst weather of the year." "I decided it would be best if we talked," I said.
This is also hard
"The
to
weather
calm
was
down.
just a happy accident." Davy scowled and turned toward the fireplace. "Come in, then." She walked over to a chest of drawers near her bed and brought out a thick blue cotton robe. She handed it to me and motioned to a closed door. "Go change out of your wet clothes. Wring them out in the basin or they'll take forever to dry." I did as she said, then brought the clothes out and hung them on the pegs in front of the fire. It felt wonderful to stand so close to the fireplace. In the light of the fire, I could see that the skin under my fingernails was actually a little blue. As much as I wanted to linger and warm myself, I joined Davy at her desk.
I'll get Q's up.
I noticed that the top of it had been sanded down and revarnished, though it
Amount of
still
alcohol.
bore
I
a
only
coal-black
have one
ring where the
cell.
poor
I mean,
boy
no
had
cells
charred
in
the
back.
wood.
I'm kind of down bad.
I felt rather vulnerable sitting there wearing nothing but the robe she'd given me, but there was nothing to be done about it.
You're good. Full squad.
After our previous meeting,
Up here.
I fought to avoid looking at the charred ring on her desk.
You're backing up. We should probably push.
You informed me that the full amount of my loan would be due at the end of the
all
term.
the way.
Yeah.
Are you willing to renegotiate that?
Yeah, I'm done.
Unlikely, Davy said crisply.
Bro, well,
But rest assured that if you are unable to settle accounts in coin,
They're
I'm
breaking,
still in the market for certain pieces of information.
just willing to throw that shit.
She gave a sharp, hungry smile. I nodded.
I'm down
She
to
still
run
wanted
those guys.
access to the archives.
Want to just run at them?
To our left.
I was
run
hoping
these
you
guys?
might be willing to
Yeah, I know, but where else
reconsider,
can I get
as
shot
you
from
now
if
know
they
the
up
whole
here?
story, I
He's
said.
flying out.
Someone was performing malfeasance against me. I needed to know that my blood was safe. I gave her a questioning look. Davy shrugged without taking her elbows off the desk, her expression one of vast indifference. What's more, I said, meeting her eye, it is entirely possible that my irrational behavior might have been partially due to the lingering effect of an alchemical poison I was subjected to earlier this term. Davy's expression went stiff. What? She hadn't known then. That was something of a relief.
All right.
Ambrose arranged to have me
cat.
dosed with the plumb bob about an
No, I
hour
don't.
before my admissions interview, I said. And you
I don't.
sold him the
I don't do
formula.
fantasy football. I don't even know how to
You have a lot of gall.
I'm not gonna
Davy's
lie.
pixie face was outraged and indignant, but it wasn't convincing. She was off balance and trying too hard. What I have, I said calmly, is the lingering taste of plum and nutmeg in my mouth, and the occasional irrational desire to choke people for doing nothing more offensive than jostling me on the street. Her false outrage fell away. You can't prove anything, she said. I don't need to prove anything, I said. I have no
You're
desire
already-
to see you in trouble with the masters or up against the iron law. I looked at her. I just thought you might be interested in the fact that I
Why,
was
she gotta be an old
poisoned.
lady? What if she is an old
Davy sat very still.
Oh, you're a biker? That's why.